Okay, so Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is comes in at number 53 in the 1970s. Actually just one ahead of Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. That was number 54. It's number 3 in 1974, then when it was released, number 215 of all time. And this is the only album we're covering tonight that's not on Rolling Stone's top 100 list or 500 list. Rolling Stone has no Genesis albums in their top 500 list. But this is number 2 of all time, or the number 2 ranked Genesis album on Best Ever Albums.
Behind which one?
Behind Selling England by the Pound, which was the last record that we had covered. So this is the sixth studio album from Genesis. It's also Peter Gabriel's last record with the band. We previously covered their albums Foxtrot in episode. Anyway, I had it here somewhere. The hell with it. Never mind. We already did the Foxtrot and Selling England by the Pound. But this one's a double album. It's a rock opera, so I can't wait to hear Josh's take.
It'd be episode
on
15,
this.
Matt.
Episode 15 we did for Foxtrot. Thank you, Josh. This one did sell pretty well. It peaked at number 10 in the United Kingdom and number 41 in the United States. It was their highest charting album at that time. So this is kind of a collaboration with basically Peter Gabriel writing, coming up with the story and the lyrics all on his own, and the band doing the music, basically writing the music out of jams. They would just kind of sit together and jam out, which was a very different way of writing than the band was used to before. And I'll get to that in just a little bit. But essentially, I am not going to get into this story. The essence of the story is it tells a story of a half Puerto Rican young man by the name of Rael from New York City, who was suddenly taken on a journey of self-discovery while encountering a number of bizarre creatures and incidents along the way. It just makes little to no sense. You can read in the liner notes, Peter Gabriel actually wrote out the story. I started reading it and I stopped because I just didn't care. People nobody really knows what it's really about. I don't even know if Peter Gabriel does. But so prior to this, the band had completed their tour for the Selling England by the Pound album that came out before this. And after that, Genesis booked 3 months at Headley Grange in order to write and rehearse the material for the new album. Guys, remember Headley Grange?
From Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, Led Zeppelin 4. Yeah. So Headley Grange was not a pleasant place for the band to be. Other bands, not just Led Zeppelin, had been there before to either write or record music, and it was not well taken care of. It was the band was creeped out by the aura there. There were a lot of rats running around and reports of excrement on the floor because nobody tidied up after themselves. And Collins and Hackett, guitarist Steve Hackett, remember just being very creeped out trying to sleep there at night. So they not the happiest place, but this is where they did the writing. The writing again was essentially Peter Gabriel kind of twisted the band's arm a little bit with coming up with this story. He was really hell-bent on telling the story, and so he would just go off into a room and he would write the lyrics, and the band would be off to another room, and they'd just be jamming out. So it was kind of a weird situation. It was definitely separate and not what they were used to doing. They did decide to go with a double album, and they wanted to they felt that they could give themselves more space to work on their ideas. And they also felt like they had developed enough of a following that their fans would be open to such a broad, sprawling album. So Gabriel in this album, I don't know if you guys noticed, but he purposefully stayed away from the Britishness of the previous albums that he was doing. He went with more American imagery, trying to get away from the kind of the British nature of stuff that he was doing before. A couple of incidents happened during this that kind of contributed to the to Gabriel's departure. During the recording of the record, he was invited by a filmmaker by the name of William Friedkin to work on a screenplay. This filmmaker was impressed with some of the stories that Gabriel had written and that were included in their live album that they had released a year or two prior. The band didn't want him to go. They're like, "Hey man, stay back here. Don't go write a screenplay. We're recording an album." And he's like, "Yeah, I'm going to go do this anyway." So they weren't too happy about it. He wasn't gone very long though, because the screenplay didn't amount to much, and so he ended up coming back. to continue with the record. But shortly, I think it was after that his wife suffered an infection. She was pregnant with their first child. And while she was, in the process of giving birth, she was infected. She did get an infection from the spinal tap, not the spinal tap, with the medication or whatever that they were giving her, the epidural. There you go. And so that led to complications in the actual delivery and the baby. For a period of time, they weren't sure if his daughter was going to survive. So it was a very traumatic experience for Gabriel, which caused him to leave Wales, where they were recording the album, several times to go be with his family. And the band, particularly bassist Mike Rutherford and keyboardist Tony Banks, were not very forgiving of this. They were very critical and angry with him. So that kind of was a little bit of rift in the band at the time for that. So I have a couple of other fun facts here. During the recording of the record, Brian Eno was also in the studio working on his album Taking Tiger Mountain. And Peter Gabriel is a big fan of Brian Eno, and he asked him to come in and actually use some of his synthesizer magic on this record, which he did, particularly with the vocal tracks of songs like The Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging and In the Cage. Eno is credited on this record with what is called enosification or enosification. I don't know if it's a long O or short O, but there you go. And in return for his contribution on this record, the band sent Phil Collins upstairs to play drums on Eno's record. So that was the payment. So Phil Collins, and so if you guys remember when we covered Brian Eno's album earlier, Phil Collins was playing drums on that, and that was because of, this was when Phil Collins first became friends, I guess, with Eno and started playing with him.
And Eno's everywhere.
Yeah. I think he's going to start popping up even more and more the further we get along.
What is that literary figure that's like in everything at one point or another? I'm forgetting. But yeah, Eno is starting to feel like that character. I'll have to remember who that figure is. But
the cover of this record was designed by Hypnosis, which, if you recall, this is the graphic design company that did all the Pink Floyd albums. So, and they would work with Genesis on a couple of other albums in the future as well. The reviews of this album were generally favorable, but like a lot of albums that we've covered, they've gotten they've gotten higher praise as time has gone on. Many people say it's one of, if not their best works, the best works of the band's career, and both Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins later said that they believe that this is the band's crowning achievement. After the release of the record, the band did embark on a 102 tour date across North America and Europe, playing the entirety of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which not all the band members were big fans of. They thought it was kind of weird to go out there and play an entire album that nobody really knew. But Peter Gabriel, again, was very much wanting to do that, and he won out. The tour did suffer a slight delay after guitarist Steve Hackett crushed a wine glass with his hand, which severed a tendon in his wrist. So, and that set them back. And at this point, it put the band in even further debt. So, by the time they finished the tour, they were very much in debt, like 1.6 billion pounds of today's money. So, yeah. The tour was elaborate. They had 3 large screens which flashed over 1,400 slides throughout the show, but they never really worked the way that they were supposed to. There was a lot of technical issues with it. And also it showcased Peter Gabriel and all the various costumes that he was in. One of them, during the Colony of Slippermen song, he comes out as a Slipper Man, which is discovered as a figure covered in lumps with inflatable genitalia that emerged onto the stage by crawling out of a penis-shaped tube.
What?
Yep. And I've posted on Twitter a montage of the various Peter Gabriel costumes that he wore in his years in Genesis, and it's quite interesting. The costume for the Slipperman was also so large that Gabriel had trouble getting the microphone near his mouth, so sometimes they couldn't really hear him singing. Phil Collins later called the displays, quote, ostentatious and the inspiration for Spinal Tap. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has called the tour, at the time, called the tour a spectacle on par with anything attempted in the world of rock to that point. During this tour is when Peter Gabriel decided that he was going to leave the band, and he did so pretty early. They were on a show, I believe, in Cleveland in November of '74, and Peter Gabriel basically said, at the end of this tour, I'm going to leave. The rest of the band felt it was a friendly split, but they decided to continue with playing throughout the rest of the tour, and Gabriel would later would quit later on. Variety of reasons for this, but basically Peter Gabriel was kind of becoming the star of the band. The band was getting frustrated with the fact that the press was more focused on the theatrics and the costumes more so than the music. Tony Banks later said that, quote, Pete was also getting too big for the group. He was being portrayed as if he was the man, and it really wasn't like that. It was a difficult thing to accommodate, so it was actually a bit of a relief when he left. So I got a few more things on what happened the years after this, but this is the last time we're covering Genesis. This is a little different, I think, than the records that we've covered before, and I am interested to hear what we think. So, John, I think it's your turn to go first. What do you think of The Lamb?
Yeah, man, this was a tough listen. It's certainly not a bad album. It is, as I was listening to you talk about Phil Collins' quote there, this is a type of prog rock album that sometimes a struggle for me because it's just too much. It's just too much for me as a vehicle of art. I would have rather this been spread out. If you're gonna make a big concept album like this, I have to have some idea of what your concept is, and I never was able to connect to like Gabriel's lyrics. And so the second time I almost went as you, Matt. I said, okay, instead of trying to decipher this story, let me listen to this and what made this easier was that I like Genesis as a musical outfit way more when I'm not hearing Peter Gabriel. Like Peter Gabriel's voice, there's some quality about it for me that is it wasn't as hard on Foxtrot for me, but on this album, and I struggle with Peter Gabriel's solo stuff for this reason too. It's just, there's like a sameness to it for me, but not in a good way. I'm doing a bad job of explaining that, but so I listened to it as a purely musical endeavor, which was easy on the back end of this, Matt, because the back end of me felt more like it was a lot more instrumental than the front end, in my opinion. Yeah. Would I go nuts in thinking that? Nope. Because it was so as a result, I like the back end of this album a lot more than I like the front end. And I think some of that was because I was able to listen to it as almost a pure musical endeavor. And that's where I recognized it, but I was able to lock in more on the guitar playing, which I liked on this album quite a bit, actually. And some of the interesting things that Phil Collins was doing on the drums as well. Like he was playing up high. I took the hi-hat earlier, but this is the album I'm talking about with that. He's in the hi-hat quite a bit on this. And there's synth that is interesting, but it was too long for me. The worst thing that can happen to me in an album started happening to me in this. It's where I'm listening to an album and it's hard for me to stay in the soup. And I constantly had to drag myself back into this album, which normally is an indictment. I think what also hurt it a little bit was that there was another long album, the Elton John album, which I never struggled with that. Yeah. And so I didn't like this anywhere near as much as I liked Foxtrot. On Foxtrot, I was leaning slightly to the like. I have to say this one didn't do it for me. I don't believe I'll ever revisit this album, to be quite honest. It was just too much for me. It's too much of the excesses of prog rock. And it had that vague, like, fairies and fantasy vibe, which never really does it for me. It was not a hard pass, but not my favorite album we've covered. I am looking forward, though, to, Matt, hearing what it is from you that connects about this album so much. And I'm open to revisiting this idea.
Okay.
So this is by far their most ambitious album, as Matt went through in the bio, and I felt that listening to it. In some ways, I feel like this is kind of their most conventional sounding album. I felt like it was less proggy than other albums, and it seemed to steer more into like Phil Collins Genesis a little bit, like dabbling into that area in a way. I felt like there was more kind of straight pop songs on this, and like Counting Out Time, I kind of thought about, and Carpet Crawlers, things like that. I kind of picked up on more, and those appealed to me more than maybe some of the earlier Genesis stuff. Because it's so ambitious, it's kind of hard. And, you know, I was griping about this before we even started listening to it. So I did try and break it up, listening to it to kind of digest it, be able to digest it more. And so I kind of listened to it as the sides of the album that were, as they broke it up like that, to try and to get it, to get on its wavelength. I found the first album to be more, I liked it more than the second half of the album.
Oh, it's funny. I felt the exact opposite.
Yeah, I think because it did kind of flow as like with more traditional guitar parts and like the singing. I feel like I may just be mixing up Gabriel and Phil Collins's voice, but I didn't hear a lot of Peter Gabriel singing on this, or
he's
maybe
all over the place. They can sound similar. No, this is Peter Gabriel doing the vocals for sure.
This is definitely Peter Gabriel. Yeah,
I must just be conflating their voices in my head then, because
there are similarities. I would agree with that, but this is, and some would say that that Phil Collins kind of got a little bit of his style from Gabriel, but no, this is Gabriel singing for sure.
Okay,
there's a like art school, almost whiny tone to Gabriel's that is never in Collins's, which always sounds more like tied to, like, Phil Collins always seems to me like he's singing like the 50s and 60s pop that he loved to some degree, and he cover that stuff, whereas Gabriel always is more soaring to me, if that makes sense. I don't know. That's how I differentiate them, I guess.
I don't find Peter Gabriel's voice as annoying, I guess, as you do. The singing was never a point of contention for me. I like the use of synth on this album as well. I thought that was good. There in Hairless Heart, that the synth has like this haunting type of sound to it. I feel like the second quote unquote album is almost more ambitious than the first part of the album. There's a lot more like ambient sound. I feel like Eno is more in that now that I know that he was involved. There is more, like John said, there's more just straight up instrumental type of tracks, and I think that harkens back more to the earlier Genesis stuff that we heard. But by the time I got to the second album, even breaking it up, I kind of like lost the through line on what they were trying to do. I never really even paid attention to the lyrics on this album, to be honest. It was more
smart move.
So I never even picked up on the fact that it was a story or concept album. I just kind of paid attention to the music, and that was the thing that kind of held my attention.
Well, it certainly didn't help that Here Comes the Supernatural Anesthesia, which is one of the more ridiculous songs we've ever covered lyrically. It was right in the middle of it, where it's just like, that was where I was struggling to fight in, right? And it's kind of like, you got to give me more lyrically than this. This is painful. So,
and even something like The Waiting Room, which is kind of I would say more avant-garde than anything, with the chimes at the beginning. I mean, it does transition into more of a traditional, sounding song, but I think I mean, Peter Gabriel he's going for it here, I guess. And I'm not sure. Oh, the other big thing is this album rewards listening to on headphones. I feel like I got a lot more out of it listening to it on headphones and noticed things more than I did when I was listening to it in the car. So that's something, and it's just too ambitious for me ultimately. I think I like Selling England by the Pound more as an album, and as a Genesis outfit than I did on this. But
I agree.
They are they're certainly going for it here, and maybe it's hurt by the fact that Gabriel kind of did all of the lyric. They weren't used to doing the songwriting separately and just kind of mixing it up. Maybe it didn't work as well as a result.
Well, and Tony Banks said later on that one of the hard things to do was to play some of these songs in isolation, because the lyrics are so tied into the quote unquote story that it's just weird to play like any of these songs on their own.
Really.
Which is why in later years, after Peter Gabriel left, when they play these songs, they usually kind of play them as like a medley. They kind of just throw different parts together, and they don't really do the actual song.
It's also like hilarious to think of like Phil Collins, who's so different personality-wise than Peter. Like that song I was joking about, like "Here Comes the Supernatural Anesthesist," right? There's like lines like "Death approaches Rael with his special canister, releases a puff, and appears to walk away, content into the wall. He wants you to snuff it. He's such a fine dancer." It's like you can't see Phil Collins writing that or singing that, so it's impossible to think of, to me, the old Genesis. That's why Genesis is so fascinating to me, because they're such different bands, like but I'm sorry, Matt, you've been very patient. I know this is one of your faves. So
it's also interesting because I think I was gonna try to do a synopsis of the story, and really I'm going through each like song and stuff, and basically all it is he's like a dude in New York that gets swallowed up by this cloud. He gets taken away, and he falls asleep, and he wakes up, and he's in this weird strange place with these strange people, and then then he has this event, and then he falls asleep, and then the same thing happens again. He just keeps coming across a bunch of people, one of which is his brother, and at the end, like he tries to save his brother from drowning, and then he saves him, and he looks at his brother, and it's himself. So it's like, where am I? It's like split personality. What's going on? And that's it. It's like, did he die? Like what? So it doesn't matter. Like it's just a ridiculous kind of thing.
To write down the story, Matt, because I thought you might synopsize it, and I'm like, it seems like it's this dude who's like this Puerto Rican street hustler who goes to New York.
Graffiti artist, John. He was a graffiti artist.
So I didn't know what he was something, right? Rough around the edges, and he's just in New York, and it's okay. He's idealistic, and then it seems like, the big bad city gets him, and then it seems like he evaporates into the wind, and you're not sure like if he dies or like, I mean, you only get this by like piecing together like the abstract, but am I right? Is that kind of like what the story is?
Yeah, pretty much. And he goes around and he sees these different people, and he has his first sexual encounter, which is the erogenous zones that Josh loved so much. He ends up having sex with serpents later on, and
that's why I thought he was a street hustler, because there's a lot of like him, picking up people, and they do mention that he's kind of turning tricks at one point and stuff. So. Yeah, I didn't get graffiti artist, but like,
it's just a bunch of weird stuff that Gabriel. Actually, Gabriel was mad. He wanted to name him Rael. He didn't want him to be like he wanted it to be kind of like this ambiguous type of name. But he almost changed it because the Who Sell Out. He realized that the Who Sell Out used the name Rael on that record. There's a couple of there's Rael Part 1, Rael Part 2. So but anyway, so I mean, no, this is not a lyrics thing for me at all. This is about the music. So this album, as far as the Peter Gabriel Genesis stuff goes, this was the one that took me the longest to get into, because I don't really see this as a prog album at all. I think that I agree with Josh. I think this is much more conventional. You don't have the movements within songs nearly as much as you did on the other albums. These are more straightforward songs, many of which are like 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes long. That's
fair.
The longest song on here is, what is it, 8:13? 8:20, the Slipperman, the Colony of Slipperman, which actually does have a couple of movements, so that's more of a proggy song. That's 8:20, so you're not getting like, last album on, there was like the Cinema Show was like over 10 minutes, the Epping Forest was 11, Tupper's Ready before that was like 20 something. So you're getting, and there's many more songs that they're fitting in, so they're more tightly constructed. So I view this as kind of I don't really view this as a prog type album. I absolutely love Peter Gabriel's voice. I don't know I love, because he does the soft, gentle, beautiful kind of melodic, falsetto almost type song, and then he does like the screaming stuff that he'll do like in either The Lamb or in what is it? Back in New York City. I love that song. That's just a very heavy kind of droning guitar sound on that. So I love Peter Gabriel's voice, whether it's here or in his solo stuff. So I I don't know. If you don't like it, you don't like it. But I think it's great. I like the variety there, and I think he's got just a really strong voice. This album took me a while to get into. I when I was first started getting into Genesis, I really liked, kind of the stuff from the previous albums. Each one of those albums, I would say, has at least one track that's far superior to any of the songs that's on this record, with the exception maybe of the Carpet Crawlers, which I think is probably the best song on this record. It was also one of the 2 singles on it. But each one of those other albums had like an epic, like the Trespass has the knife, and Nursery Crime has the musical box, and Foxtrot has, Supper's Ready, and you could probably make the Firth the Fifth or Cinema Show on Selling England by the Pound. So those I loved, and this was not like that. I kind of wanted them to go back to have more of that epic sound. So the fact that this is kind of more traditional, songs was something that was a little off-putting to me at first. But over time, I really started liking the first half of the record, and I still do. I would make the argument that the first half of this record is probably their most consistent effort of any of the Genesis stuff that they've done before. I don't think that there's anything wrong at all with that first part of this record. It was always the second half that took me I started losing interest. It's a little bit long. I'm kind of, you've got moments like, the waiting room, which is all this like noise kind of at the beginning, and even though it's brought back later on, I mean, that's the part when I saw the musical box, the Recreation band play this live. I mean, that's the song that everybody gets up and goes to the bathroom, because it's like, all right, I don't need to sit through all the chimes and stuff, Yeah. But as I listened to it this time, again, a number of times, I really started liking the second side too. I think I still like the first side better, but I appreciated the second side more. I'm just having trouble finding something that I don't like about this. If you just look at each song individually, there's great stuff going on here. Like I said, Back in New York City, really cool song. Very, very heavy, and there's the bass. Rutherford's bass on that is it's this droning sound that just really kind of, I don't know, gives it a lot of body to that song. In the Cage is great. There's a lot of cool keyboard work going on here. There's a lot of Tony Banks is shining all over this place. Steve Hackett, the guitarist, kind of took a little bit of a back seat, and he's actually mentioned in a documentary that I saw that this is not one of his favorites because he's not there as much. That this is much more of a Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford album in terms of that. And obviously Phil Collins is going nuts. But you've got stuff like Fly on a Windshield, this really cool, musical part that kind of goes in there. Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging might be a little bit more of a novelty type song, but it's just, I love the way that builds. And again, I love, his voice on it. Carpet Crawlers, like I said, just beautiful song, just really, really good, great melody. And I love Gabriel's voice on that as well.
That kind of reminds me of a New Pornographer song in a way. And that's one of my favorite bands.
Interesting. Okay.
I think just because of the repetition, they do some of that.
They repeat the chorus over and over again. Mm-hmm. So but the Lamia's got some great moments on it. The Colony of Slippermen does too. Riding the Scree's a really cool instrumental part at the end there.
Yeah, that was cool.
That's another one. I had to count that out. I think that's a 9/8 time, like the end of Supper's Ready as well. So that's got a really cool time signature to it. And I like the way that it ends within the Rapids going into it. That's a really upbeat song that finishes this album well. So it's absolutely a long album. It is a lot to digest, and I have known this record for 20 plus years, and it's just now getting to the point where I'm like, yeah, I love this whole thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So even the second side. So I'm not surprised at all. This is a lot to digest, and it's certainly not for everybody, just like every Genesis album would be. But there's plenty of stuff going on here for me that I like, and you're starting to see, the music starting to deviate a little bit and away from the prog stuff. They still dabble in it. There's elements, even in Invisible Touch. There's a song called Domino, which is kind of more of a prog rock song because there's different elements to it. But this is where they start to kind of do a little bit more of the more succinct pop type songs. So I don't care about the story. Don't listen to this album for the story at all. It makes no sense. It's about the music totally for me.
Well, the songs even kind of flow into one another at times. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like that movement type of structure where if you're not paying attention to when the tracks switch, it's almost like one song. Yeah.
So. So I don't know if I convinced you. Well, I probably didn't come. That's not my job to convince you. But yeah, it's it doesn't surprise me that it's hard to get into. So
yeah, I mean, I reserve the right to listen to this in the future and have it grow on me. And I do think it's very interesting that you guys found the first half. The first half is more conventional, but I think I was more interested in Genesis when they were complex, right? And then when they went straight, it's like I have a love-hate relationship with Peter Gabriel and his solo stuff, to be quite honest. And maybe that's my burden, that's the piece that's the hard thing for me, that it isn't. Yeah, and there's some Peter Gabriel I like. Really, most of it's located on Shock the Monkey, that album, which I do like. It's very experimental, but some other stuff, especially the late 80s Peter Gabriel or the world music Peter Gabriel, is tough for me. And I felt that crept on here a little bit, even though it was beforehand, and maybe that's my barrier. But I can't say that it's not a good album in terms of musically and playing, because there's a lot of stuff I liked musically for sure. It's just I just wish it was shorter. And like I said, if you're gonna give me a concept album and like you can't even give me, I mean, even Townsend was able to make a more coherent storyline than this. That was a struggle for me. An album that has so many lyrics that doesn't tie into anything is tough for me.
No, that's totally understandable. I would also say that the production on here is real. As if you listen to some of the first two albums, like the earlier stuff, the production's really better. It's not that good. This production is very good. I think this is a very well produced album, and you can tell that. That they had more money, even though they were in debt, they were using more money to create their records, and they had better equipment for sure. And that's one of the things that stands out here. If you listen to like Nursery Crime or something, it's a very primitive type of recording that they were using. This is the last Genesis album that we cover. And a couple things just to tie up with the band. So after Gabriel left, they started auditioning vocalists. They put an ad out which over 400 people responded to, and so eventually what would happen is Collins would be teaching people the vocal parts, and they just realized that nobody else was really doing what they wanted to do, and they figured, well, Phil's actually knows what he's doing. He sounds good, so let's just use him. So they decided to continue on as a 4-piece, and they did two albums in 1976. After which Steve Hackett, the guitarist, left, wanted to pursue his own musical efforts, and that's when Genesis became a 3-piece, which is what they did for throughout the 80s, and the culminating in 86 probably with their massive album with Invisible Touch, with all the hits that they had, and so they started getting really popular there. They are one of the they had a total of 6 albums with Phil Collins at the helm, and they actually did one more album in 1997 called Calling All Stations, which did not have Phil Collins. It had some dude named Ray Wilson, but that was their last proper album. They've sold, the total albums that they sold is between 100 and 150 million records worldwide. They're one of the best-selling artists of all time, and they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2010 by Phish's Trey Anastasio. And they just started, actually, the last Domino tour. The first show, I think, was a couple nights ago in England. I will be seeing them later on in December in Boston, hopefully. Nice. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah, I guess Collins his health is really not good.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, he can't.
I was going to say, are they going to make it?
That's a good question, John. No, I think his voice. I think I heard that his voice might be pretty decent still, but he really can't. He can't do much of anything. His son plays. His 20-year-old son does the drumming, which I guess he's pretty good. But yeah, I feel kind of bad for Phil Collins. He's like, he can't even hold the drumstick, or he's had really bad back issues, or something to that effect. So, but hopefully I'll go. Hopefully, I was supposed to go to a show the other night, but it got canceled I was standing in line to see Dawes, and they canceled the show right at the last minute because somebody tested positive for COVID. So, hopefully that doesn't happen for the Genesis show. But yeah, so there you go.
So
do you fingers for you,
Matt? With your relationship with Genesis, is this where you stop listening, or do you go on to listen to?
So I went on to the album that came right after this is called Trick of a Tale, which I think is really good. It's got some really cool moments. It's proggy. It's got some more of the Phil Collins stuff. And I would also highly recommend the 1980 album Duke. That's got some some hits on it. It's a longer album, but it's got some really cool stuff. So the cool thing about Genesis is even when they went more pop and they started doing more traditional songs, they would still throw in cool little beats, time signatures, offbeat kind of. They throw in enough nuggets in there that make you realize, yeah, they're still trying to scratch that itch of being a little bit more creative, a little bit different, kind of throwing in some surprises there. And Duke's got some moments like that. So those two albums in particular for me, I think post Gabriel albums are the ones that I listen to the most. But I know people love like Abacab, and they have a self-titled album that people really like, and then Invisible Touch, obviously, which the first half of the album are all like #1 singles, and then the song Domino itself is a really good song too. So I still like them a lot. I'm looking forward to seeing them. Hopefully Phil Collins will still be alive.
Yeah.